Happy weekend to you all. Has Washington just fired its strongest warning yet to Nigeria? Is this merely another congregational debate in the United States? Or could it mark the beginning of a major shift in US-Nigeria relations? More importantly, what message does it send when American lawmakers decide that protecting religious freedom should determine whether billions in foreign assistance continue to flow? These are no longer hypothetical questions. They are now at the center of political storm unfolding in Washington. And if the legislation eventually becomes law, its consequences could extend far beyond diplomatic headlines. It could redefine how the United States engages not only with Nigeria, but with governments across Africa. The United States House of Representatives has approved amendments to the fiscal year 2027 National Security, Department of State, and Related Programs Appropriation Act that will tie American assistance to Nigeria to measurably progress in protecting Christians from religiously motivated violence. Initially, the legislation proposed withholding half of U.S. assistance until Nigeria met specific conditions. But that was only the beginning. Republican Congressman Greg Steube successfully pushed an amendment that goes much further, seeking to withhold 100% of U.S. assistance until the Nigerian government demonstrates meaningful actions. The amendment passed the House, dramatically raising the political stakes. That vote immediately raises another question. Why is Congress taking such an extraordinary step against one of America's most important partners in Africa? Supporters of the legislation argue that the answer is simple. They believe Nigerian government has failed to adequately protect citizens, Christian communities facing repeated attacks from extremist violence. According to the lawmakers behind the bill, American taxpayers should not continue funding governments that are perceived to have made insufficient progress in safeguarding vulnerable populations. Whether one agrees that the assessment or not, the message from the House is unmistakable. Accountability is becoming a central condition of American foreign assistance. Congressman Greg Steube left little room for ambiguity. Following the votes, he declared that American taxpayers should never bankroll governments that turn a blind eye while Christians are adopted, tortured, and murdered. During debates on the House floor, he argued that Christians and other religious minorities in Nigeria continue to face horrific violence from extremist groups operating within immunity. According to Steube, the issue is not about punishing ordinary Nigerians. Instead, he insisted that foreign assistance should be used as leverage to encourage governments to fulfill the most basic responsibility, which is protecting the lives of their citizens. But here is where the debate becomes even more significant. The legislation is not simply about reducing aids. It reflects a growing philosophy within sections of the U.S. Congress that foreign assistance should no longer be automatic. Increasingly, lawmakers argue that the aids should be linked to measurable performance, particularly on issues involving human rights, religious freedom, and national security. In other words, Washington appears to be asking a broader question. If American taxpayers finance foreign governments, shouldn't those governments demonstrate clear progress in protecting fundamental freedoms? Republican Congressman Willie Moore, who introduced the original provision, reinforced that argument after the House approved the legislation. Moore said Christians in Nigeria continue to endure horrific violence while much of the international community looks away. He argued that the bill sends a clear signal that religious persecution cannot simply be ignored. According to Moore, the legislation requires measurable progress in protecting Christian communities, addressing threats posed by armed groups, and enabling displaced families to return safely to their ancestral communities. His position reflects growing concern among some American lawmakers that religious violence deserves far greater international attention than it currently receives. Yet, there is another dimension that cannot be ignored. The bill does not merely impose conditions. It also proposed continued cooperation in areas such as police training, accountability initiatives, and anti-human trafficking programs. It directs the U.S. State Department to report to Congress on additional measures needed to improve protection for Christian communities. In other words, supporters argue that the objective is not simply to punish Nigeria, but to combine pressure with practical institutional support. Whether that balance can actually be achieved remains an open question. For Nigeria, however, the implications should be profound. The United States has long been one of Nigeria's most significant international partners, supporting programs in health, humanitarian assistance, security cooperation, governance, and economic development. If substantial portions of the assistance were eventually suspended, the diplomatic consequences could extend well beyond financial considerations. Such a decision would inevitably shape political relations between Abuja and Washington, while influencing how other international partners assess Nigerian security challenges. Even before becoming law, the legislation has already intensified global attention on religious violence within the country. Supporters of the bill insist that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary responses. They argue that repeated reports of attack against Christian communities demand stronger international actions rather than routine diplomatic statements. Critics, however, are likely to raise a different concern. They may argue that suspending assistance could unintentionally affect humanitarian programs serving vulnerable Nigerians while reducing Americans' ability to influence development through continued engagement. This tension lies at the heart of the debate. Does conditional aid strengthen accountability, or does it risk hurting the very people it seeks to protect? It is equally important to understand that the House vote does not automatically change American policy. Under the U.S. legislative process, the appropriation bill must still pass through the Senate before any financial version can be negotiated. If the Senate adopts a different position, both chambers must reconcile their differences before legislation reaches the president for signature or veto. Until that process is completed, no immediate suspension of assistance takes place. Nevertheless, House approval alone carries considerable political significance because it demonstrates growing bipartisan attention to development inside Nigeria. The timing of the legislation is also noteworthy. Nigeria continues to battle multiple security threats, including terrorism, armed banditry, kidnapping, communal violence, and organized criminal networks operating across several regions. Successive Nigerian governments have repeatedly stated that security remains the highest priority and that operations continue against armed groups threatening communities regardless of ethnicity or religion. At the same time, domestic and international organizations continue urging stronger civilian protection, faster prosecution, and more effective security reforms. The House votes now place those ongoing challenges under an even brighter international spotlight. Perhaps the biggest question is not whether this legislative ultimately becomes law. The bigger question is whether it signals a new era in American foreign policy towards Africa. For decades, strategic partnership often focused primarily on diplomacy, trade, and security cooperation. Increasingly, however, Congress appeared determined to place governance, accountability, and religious freedom at the center of those relationships. If this approach expands beyond Nigeria, other countries could eventually face similar conditions tied to future American assistance. The legislation remains only one step away from becoming law, but politically, the message has been already delivered. Washington is signaling that future partnership may increasingly depend not only on shared strategic interests, but also on measurable outcomes involving human rights and civilian protection. Whether one views the House vote as necessary accountability or excessive pressure, one reality is impossible to ignore. The debates moved far beyond foreign aid. It has become a test of how the world's most powerful democracy intends to engage with Africa's largest democracy in the years ahead. I am Chimezrim Okoro, and thanks for watching.